Now that we have examined the verbal and physical boundary violations and best practices as an educator, we're going to look at the emotional and social or relationship boundaries, violations, and best practices. So, some violations of emotional boundaries include favoritism, so spending alone time with a student or giving gifts to only specific students with no occasion at all. That would definitely be a violation of emotional boundaries. Next would be encouraging emotional dependencies. So, I did talk about the first step in grooming. Um, Encouraging this emotional dependency that you have already created by violating the verbal boundary would be an example of an emotional boundary violation. Next, promoting oneself as a friend or confidant. This one also goes hand in hand with encouraging emotional dependencies. You would basically be telling a student, oh, you can tell me anything. Don't worry, you're not going to get in trouble. You can share any information with me. That's definitely a violation of emotional boundaries because you're supposed to be their educator, not their best friend. Lastly, intentionally not intervening when a student is in distress would be a violation of an emotional boundary. Just because you're supposed to be there to support your student and not intervening would be promoting the act of distress in the student. Some of the best practices to prevent violating emotional boundaries would be to treat all students equally, to maintain a professional distance. This one also went hand in hand with the physical boundary violations. To refer students to appropriate support services. So if you see a student in distress and you don't contact student services, you don't contact admin, you would still be violating emotional boundaries. And then lastly, to report concerns to relevant authorities. This one is also um, kind of similar to the one above it, just because you would have to say something to admin just before you tell the student that someone else is there for them. You wouldn't necessarily have to do it before, but both of them just go hand in hand. Next, we're going to look at social boundaries or relationship boundaries. Some of the violations include flirting or engaging in romantic relationships with students, both face-to-face and online. Definitely inappropriate. Meeting students alone or outside of school without educational context. So if you run into them at the grocery store and you say hello, that's okay. But if you invite them to do the groceries with you and to walk you back to your car, that is definitely inappropriate. Using technology to perpetuate relationships beyond professional obligations would mean you are using your personal device to contact students and to not talk about educational related items. And then lastly, using personal social media accounts to communicate with students would definitely be inappropriate. You should always use authorized communication channels. That's one of the best practices in this slide. Such as if you're part of like a district school board, we use EDSB to contact students so that all communication can be tracked and viewed by admin. You should also keep all of your interactions professional and avoid creating personal relationships with students. That one will be a little more explained in depth when we get into blurred boundaries. And then you should always maintain transparency in all student interactions. So always be honest and open with your students. So just to reflect on these two boundary types, emotional boundaries must maintain professional objectivity and student independence, and social boundaries persevere the integrity of the educator-student dynamic. Some repercussions of this, also similar to the ones that we saw before, would be loss of trust, the potential harm to students, the damage to the professional reputation of yourself as an educator, and then, of course, the legal and disciplinary consequences.